The saddest thing about losing someone is that you usually do not realize their value until the room feels empty without them. The music floated gently through the grand ballroom of the Whitmore Grand Hotel as hundreds of guests celebrated another historic year for Whitmore Global Holdings. Crystal chandeliers cast rivers of golden light across polished marble floors while business leaders, politicians, and celebrities raised their glasses to the man standing at the center of it all. Alexander Whitmore had built one of the largest investment empires in the country before turning 40. Financial magazines called him brilliant. Television hosts called him unstoppable. Tonight, surrounded by luxury and applause, he looked exactly like a man who had everything. A string quartet played softly near the stage while enormous floral arrangements filled the room with the scent of fresh roses and white lilies. Reporters captured every smile, every handshake, every carefully planned moment. Alexander stood beside several members of his executive board, answering questions about future projects and international expansion. He wore a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, and his expression carried the same calm confidence that had made investors trust him with billions of dollars. Around him, the celebration continued exactly as planned. His assistant quietly approached. "Mr. Whitmore, the final guests have arrived." Alexander nodded without looking away from the conversation. "Good. Tonight should be memorable." The assistant smiled politely before disappearing into the crowd. Across the ballroom, guests whispered about the evening. Some admired the decorations. Others discussed business opportunities. A few noticed that despite all the success surrounding him, Alexander had arrived alone. One older investor leaned toward his wife and quietly said, "I remember when his wife used to attend these events. She always made this place feel warmer." The woman glanced toward the stage and sighed softly. "I have not seen her in years." Alexander pretended not to hear them, but the words settled somewhere deep inside him. 5 years had passed since the divorce. 5 years since Naomi. Carter had quietly walked out of his life carrying nothing except a small suitcase and the simple wedding ring he had once placed on her finger. She had not fought over money. She had not asked for the mansion or the investments. She had simply left behind a handwritten note that he had never been able to throw away. The orchestra stopped as the master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight as we celebrate excellence, vision, and leadership." Applause filled the room. Alexander accepted another glass of sparkling cider from a server and looked across the sea of elegant faces. Everything he had worked for stood before him. The company, the recognition, the respect. Yet for reasons he could never explain, the victory felt strangely quiet. Then the enormous ballroom doors slowly opened. At first, almost nobody noticed. A woman in a simple ivory dress stepped inside, her natural curls resting gently over her shoulders as the soft lights touched her face. She wore no expensive jewelry. No dramatic entrance announced her arrival. But one by one, conversations began to fade. The music stopped. Glasses lowered. Even the photographers seemed uncertain where to point their cameras. Alexander looked toward the entrance without thinking. The moment his eyes met hers, the entire room disappeared. Naomi stood there with the same quiet grace he remembered, only now there was a confidence about her that he had never truly seen before. She was not looking for attention. She was not looking for revenge. She simply stood there, calm and dignified, as though she belonged exactly where she was. Alexander felt his heart tighten in a way that no business failure had ever caused. Around him, the celebration continued to stand perfectly still. In that single moment, surrounded by everything he had spent his life building, the billionaire understood that the greatest success of his career could never compare to the one person he had allowed to walk away. Naomi did not move as the entire ballroom stared at her. She simply offered a quiet smile to the hostess standing near the entrance and handed her an invitation card. The young woman looked down at the elegant envelope, then back at Naomi with obvious surprise before nodding respectfully. Alexander watched every small movement from across the room, barely hearing the conversations around him. 5 years had passed, but she looked almost exactly the same. The same warm brown eyes, the same calm expression, the same quiet grace that had once turned an empty apartment into a place he had called home. Yet there was something different now. She no longer carried the uncertainty that had followed her during the last years of their marriage. She stood with the confidence of someone who no longer needed permission to belong anywhere. As Naomi slowly walked into the ballroom, guests instinctively stepped aside. Some recognized her immediately. Others only knew the stories whispered through New York society. Alexander Whitmore's former wife. The woman who had disappeared without asking for a dollar from one of the largest fortunes in the country. The woman nobody had seen since the divorce. His business partner, Richard Hale, leaned closer and spoke quietly. I did not know she was invited. Alexander did not answer. The truth was, he had no idea why she was there. Before he could move, the master of ceremonies smiled toward the entrance. Ladies and gentlemen, we have one final guest joining us this evening. Please welcome the founder of the Carter Educational Foundation, one of the fastest-growing literacy charities in the nation. The room filled with polite applause. Alexander blinked, almost believing he had heard the name incorrectly. Naomi continued walking toward the stage with gentle confidence. Behind her, several members of the city's philanthropic board stood to greet her personally. A senator's wife embraced her warmly. The director of a children's hospital shook her hand with obvious admiration. Even the mayor crossed the room to welcome her. Alexander remained completely still. He knew Naomi had always loved helping children. When they first met, she spent every Saturday volunteering at a small community library in Brooklyn. He remembered watching her sit on the floor surrounded by books while children listened to her stories as though she were creating entire worlds with nothing but her voice. Back then, he had promised himself that if he ever became successful, he would give her everything she deserved. Somewhere along the way, he had forgotten that none of those things were what she had truly wanted. The chairman of the charity board stepped onto the stage and raised his glass. 5 years ago, Mrs. Naomi Carter started with a single reading program for underprivileged children. Today, her foundation supports more than 100 community centers across the country and has helped thousands of young students discover the joy of education. The applause grew louder. Alexander looked around the ballroom. The same people who once believed Naomi was too ordinary for his world were now standing to honor her. He remembered another gala years ago when she had quietly stood beside him, wearing a simple navy dress, while society women whispered that she did not belong. He had heard those whispers. Worse, he had allowed them to change him. Naomi accepted the microphone with both hands. Her voice remained soft, but every person in the room listened. Success is a beautiful thing, she said. But the greatest gift anyone can receive is the chance to believe they matter. Alexander lowered his eyes. Those exact words sounded painfully familiar. Long ago, when his first business had almost failed, Naomi had sat beside him in their tiny apartment and told him, "The world may doubt you, but never doubt your own worth." He had forgotten many things over the years. He had never forgotten that. As the applause echoed through the ballroom once again, Alexander realized that the woman standing on the stage had never needed his fortune to become extraordinary. She had simply become everything she had always been. And for the first time in 5 years, he began to wonder if the person who had truly lost everything was not Naomi at all, but himself. Alexander could barely hear the applause as Naomi stepped down from the stage. People gathered around her with warm smiles and genuine admiration, asking about her foundation and the children whose lives had been changed by her work. She greeted each person with the same quiet kindness she had always carried, never trying to stand above anyone else. Watching her from across the ballroom, Alexander suddenly remembered another evening many years before, long before the expensive hotels and international business deals. Back then, they had lived in a tiny apartment above a family-owned bakery in Brooklyn. The furniture had been old, the kitchen barely large enough for 2 people, and the windows looked out over a noisy street instead of the Manhattan skyline. Yet somehow, those had been the happiest days of his life. Every morning, Naomi would wake before sunrise and make coffee while he sat at the small kitchen table studying business plans and financial reports. He had no investors, no assistants, and almost no money. There were weeks when he wondered if he should give up entirely. One evening, after another disappointing meeting with a potential investor, Alexander returned home carrying a cardboard box filled with the belongings from the office space he could no longer afford to rent. He dropped the box beside the door and sat quietly at the table. Naomi walked over and placed a simple grilled cheese sandwich in front of him. "How bad was it?" she asked softly. Alexander looked down at his hands. "They said I do not belong in that world." They said nobody would ever trust a man with nothing. Naomi sat across from him and reached for his hand. Then build something they cannot ignore. He laughed quietly, almost bitterly. What if they are right? She smiled in the gentle way he would later spend years trying to remember. When I first met you, you had nothing except a dream. I did not fall in love with a bank account. I fell in love with the man who refused to stop trying. Those words stayed with him. Months later, when his first company finally secured funding, he took Naomi to the little park near the East River where they often walked together after work. The city lights reflected across the water while boats drifted quietly in the distance. Alexander reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple silver ring. It was all he could afford. One day, he promised, I am going to give you the life you deserve. Naomi looked at the ring, then back at him. Tears filled her eyes, but she laughed softly. I already have it. The memory faded as Alexander stood alone in the ballroom. Somewhere between those simple days and the empire he had built, he had started believing that success required a different kind of life. Invitations to exclusive galas replaced quiet evenings together. Board meetings replaced weekend walks. Society magazines praised him for becoming one of the country's youngest billionaires, while people around him quietly suggested that Naomi was too ordinary for the future he was creating. At first, he ignored them. Then he started listening. Across the room, Naomi laughed gently at something a young volunteer said. The sound reached him through the music and conversations, carrying him back to the tiny apartment where she had believed in him before anyone else did. Richard stepped beside him and followed his gaze. She seems happy, he said quietly. Alexander nodded without taking his eyes off her. She always knew how to build a home wherever she was. Richard looked at him carefully. Then why did you let her leave? Alexander closed his eyes for just a moment. Around him stood everything he had spent years fighting to achieve. Yet all he could see was a small apartment, a simple silver ring, and the woman who had once looked at a struggling young dreamer and seen a future that even he could not see himself. Richard's question stayed with Alexander long after the music resumed and the guests returned to their conversations. Why did you let her leave? The answer seemed simple once, but standing in the middle of the ballroom, watching Naomi surrounded by people whose lives she had touched, nothing about it felt simple anymore. His eyes drifted toward the stage where she was speaking with volunteers from her foundation. They laughed together naturally, the way people laughed when they felt safe. Alexander remembered a time when he had been one of those people. Years earlier, after his company began attracting national attention, invitations to exclusive events became a regular part of their lives. Naomi attended every one of them at first. She wore elegant, but modest dresses, smiled politely, and spent most evenings asking waiters their names and thanking staff members who almost everyone else ignored. More than once, he had found her sitting with the children of hotel employees, telling them stories while billionaires discussed investments nearby. She never seemed impressed by money. She only cared about people. At first, Alexander admired that about her. Then his world began to change. Board members suggested that the public image of Whitmore Global needed to evolve. Investors invited him to private clubs where old families measured success through generations of wealth and influence. Society magazines started publishing photographs of him beside politicians, celebrities, and business dynasties. Naomi never complained, but he noticed the quiet looks people gave her. Some believed she was too ordinary. Others whispered that a woman from a small neighborhood library did not fit beside one of the country's fastest rising entrepreneurs. One evening, after a fundraising gala much like this one, Alexander overheard a conversation he was never supposed to hear. Two investors stood near the balcony doors, speaking softly. He is brilliant, one of them said. But if he wants to reach the next level, he needs a different image. The other nodded. People trust success that looks familiar. Alexander never forgot those words. He told himself they did not matter, yet little by little they found a place inside his mind. The next few years passed in a blur of meetings, travel, and endless ambition. He missed birthdays. He canceled vacations. He arrived home long after midnight to find Naomi asleep on the couch with a book resting in her lap. She would always wake up when she heard the door and ask the same question. Did everything go well today? She never asked why he was late. She never complained that they barely saw each other anymore. She simply smiled and made sure he had dinner waiting in the kitchen. One rainy evening, Alexander returned home after signing the biggest contract of his career. The entire city seemed to celebrate his success, but when he walked into the house, he found Naomi sitting quietly by the window. A small suitcase rested beside the couch. The silver wedding ring lay on the coffee table. She looked at him with the same gentle eyes that had believed in him before anyone else did. "I think you already have everything you have been searching for," she said softly. Alexander loosened his tie and sighed. "Naomi, I am exhausted. Can we not do this tonight?" She nodded slowly. "That is exactly the problem." She stood up and placed a folded letter beside the ring. "I do not want your company. I do not want your money. I only wanted the man who used to come home and tell me about his dreams." Alexander looked at the letter but never opened it. Somewhere deep inside, he believed she would come back in the morning. He believed love could wait until he finished building his empire. But when the sun rose, the house was silent. The coffee pot was empty. Her favorite books were gone. Only the ring and the letter remained, waiting on the table where he had left them, quietly marking the moment he traded the life he truly wanted for the one the world told him he should have. When Naomi left, the city barely noticed. Newspapers continued writing about Alexander Whitmore's expanding business empire. Television interviews celebrated his latest acquisitions, and financial magazines placed his photograph on their covers month after month. To the outside world, he looked stronger than ever. He threw himself into work with even greater determination, filling every empty hour with meetings, flights, and negotiations. The quiet apartment they had once shared was replaced by a penthouse overlooking Central Park, but no matter how beautiful the view became, the silence always followed him home. Meanwhile, Naomi started over with almost nothing. She rented a small apartment in Brooklyn not far from the neighborhood library where she had once volunteered. The first few months were difficult. She worked part-time, organized reading programs, and spent evenings writing letters to local businesses asking for donated books and supplies. Most people politely declined. A few never answered at all. But every morning she woke up with the same simple belief she had carried since childhood. If one child discovered hope through a story, the effort was worth it. One rainy afternoon, an elderly teacher named Margaret Ellis visited the library carrying 3 old boxes filled with books. She had heard about Naomi's reading circle and wanted to help. Together they cleaned the worn covers and arranged them on simple wooden shelves. Soon, a few children from the neighborhood began stopping by after school. Then more arrived. Parents volunteered snacks. Local shop owners donated chairs and tables. What began as a tiny reading corner slowly became a community center where children could dream about a future bigger than the streets outside. Naomi never called it a charity. She simply called it home. Back at the Whitmore Gala, Alexander watched as one of the young volunteers from Naomi's foundation handed her a small photograph. She smiled the moment she saw it. Curiosity pulled him closer without thinking. As she turned slightly, he caught a glimpse of the picture. It showed a group of smiling children sitting on the floor around Naomi while she held an open book in her hands. The image looked almost identical to one he had taken years ago with an old camera during their first summer together. Richard noticed his expression. "Do you know how many children her foundation helps now?" Alexander slowly shook his head. Richard looked toward the stage. Over 20,000, according to the reports. Literacy centers, scholarships, after-school programs. She built all of it from the ground up. Alexander stared at the photograph in Naomi's hand. Once, he had believed success was measured by stock prices and skyscrapers. Looking at that simple picture, he wondered how many lives his own fortune had truly changed. The master of ceremonies returned to the microphone and invited several young students onto the stage. One little girl, no older than 8, walked nervously to the podium carrying a folded piece of paper. Naomi knelt beside her and offered an encouraging smile. The child looked out at the enormous ballroom and took a deep breath. "Miss Naomi told me that stories can change your life," she said softly. "Before I met her, I thought dreams were only for other people." The little girl looked at Naomi before continuing. "Now I want to become a teacher so I can help someone else believe too." The ballroom rose to its feet. Applause echoed beneath the crystal chandeliers, but Alexander could not move. He remembered all the times Naomi had quietly told him that real success was not about being admired. It was about leaving the world a little kinder than you found it. He had smiled at those words once, thinking they were beautiful but unrealistic. Standing there now, surrounded by the empire he had spent years building, He finally understood that while he had been creating wealth, the woman he let walk away had been creating something far more valuable. She had been creating hope. The applause slowly faded, but the image of the little girl standing beside Naomi remained fixed in Alexander's mind. Around the ballroom, guests returned to their conversations, yet something had changed. The evening no longer felt like a celebration of business success. It had quietly become a celebration of a woman who had built an entirely different kind of legacy. Naomi stepped away from the stage and joined a group of teachers and volunteers near one of the tall windows overlooking the city lights. She listened more than she spoke, smiling as they shared stories about students who had discovered a love for reading. Alexander watched from a distance, realizing that even now she was doing exactly what she had always done. She was making other people feel important. Richard gently touched his shoulder. "You should talk to her." Alexander looked down at the untouched glass in his hand. "I do not know what I would say." Richard gave a small smile. "Maybe start with the truth." Across the room, one of the foundation directors approached Naomi carrying a small velvet box. She looked surprised as he handed it to her. "We found this among some of the original donations from the first community center," he explained. "The volunteers thought you should have it." Naomi slowly opened the box. Inside rested a simple silver ring. It was not decorated with diamonds or expensive stones. It was the same ring Alexander had given her beside the East River. All those years ago, she gently touched it with her fingertips, and for a moment her smile faded into quiet reflection. Alexander felt his heart stop. He remembered leaving that ring behind on the coffee table with the letter she had written. He had believed she abandoned it forever. Richard looked into the box and then back at Alexander. "I thought you said she left everything behind." Alexander nodded slowly. "I thought she did too." Naomi carefully closed the box and held it close to her heart. The sight stirred a memory he had buried for years. A week after she left, he had finally opened the letter. The paper was folded neatly, and her handwriting remained as gentle as her voice. She had written only a few lines. "I hope one day you build everything you have ever dreamed of. I just wish you understood that you already had someone who believed in those dreams before the rest of the world did." He had read the letter once, then hidden it inside the drawer of his desk where nobody would ever find it. There were nights when he almost took it out again, but work always seemed more urgent. Another deal, another flight, another meeting, until 5 years had disappeared. A soft melody began to play as the orchestra prepared for the final dance of the evening. Couples slowly stepped onto the polished floor beneath the crystal chandeliers. Alexander noticed that Naomi quietly moved toward one of the windows instead, watching the city below. She had always preferred peaceful moments over grand celebrations. He remembered the nights they would walk through Central Park sharing roasted chestnuts from a street vendor instead of attending expensive parties. Back then, she had often told him that happiness was usually found in simple things people forgot to notice. He had smiled without really listening. Now, standing in the middle of a room filled with wealth, power, and applause, Alexander realized that every memory he treasured had nothing to do with money at all. He placed the glass down on a nearby table and took a slow breath. For 5 years, he had convinced himself that time would make the pain disappear. Instead, it had only made one truth impossible to ignore. The woman he had lost had never stopped carrying a piece of their story. And the man who had everything suddenly understood that the only thing he truly wanted was the chance to tell her he had finally learned what she had been trying to teach him all along. Alexander stood motionless for several seconds before finally taking a step toward the window where Naomi was quietly watching the lights of Manhattan. The orchestra continued playing behind them, and couples moved gracefully across the dance floor, but none of it seemed to exist anymore. 5 years of silence suddenly felt heavier than all the board meetings, interviews, and business victories that had filled his life since she left. Naomi sensed someone approaching and slowly turned around. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. They simply looked at one another, two people connected by memories that time had never truly erased. Alexander glanced at the small velvet box resting in her hands. "I thought you left it behind," he said softly. Naomi lowered her eyes to the silver ring inside. A gentle smile touched her face. "I did." Alexander looked confused. Naomi carefully closed the box. The volunteers found it a few years ago when they were cleaning out old storage boxes at the first reading center. Someone had donated a small collection of household items, and this was inside. She looked back at him. I almost gave it away again. He swallowed quietly. Why did you keep it? Naomi looked through the window toward the city skyline, glowing beneath the night sky. Because some memories deserve gratitude, even if they also carry pain. Her answer settled deep inside him. He remembered the young woman who used to sit beside him in their little apartment, believing in impossible dreams without ever asking for anything in return. He remembered the handwritten notes she slipped into his briefcase before important meetings. He remembered the evenings she waited for him with dinner growing cold because another business emergency had kept him away. He had spent years convincing himself that losing her had simply been part of the price of success. Standing beside her now, he realized success had never asked him to lose anything. He had made that choice himself. Naomi, he said quietly, I read your letter. She smiled softly. I always hoped you would. Alexander looked down at his hands. I should have come after you. Naomi did not answer immediately. Instead, she watched a young volunteer across the ballroom, helping one of the children from the foundation carry a stack of books. You know, she said, when I left, I was not angry. Alexander looked at her in surprise. You were not. She gently shook her head. I was heartbroken, but I understood that the man I loved was chasing a dream. I just realized that somewhere along the way, I had stopped being part of it. Her words carried no bitterness. That somehow made them even harder to hear. Alexander felt years of carefully hidden regret rise to the surface. I thought I was building a better future for us. Naomi looked at him with the same kindness she had shown him when he was a young man with nothing but ambition. You were building a future, she said softly. You just forgot to bring us with you. The orchestra changed to a slower melody as more couples stepped onto the dance floor. Around them, conversations filled the ballroom once again, but the world between them remained quiet. Alexander reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and carefully removed a folded piece of paper. The edges were worn from time. Naomi recognized it immediately. It was the letter she had written 5 years ago. He held it carefully, almost like something fragile. I never threw it away, he whispered. Naomi looked at the old paper and then back at him. For the first time that evening, tears quietly gathered in her eyes. Not because she still belonged to the past, but because she finally understood that the man standing before her had spent 5 years carrying a piece of it with him too. Naomi looked at the folded letter resting in Alexander's hands, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. The music from the ballroom drifted softly through the air while the lights of New York shimmered beyond the tall windows. Around them, people laughed, danced, and celebrated, completely unaware that 2 lives separated by 5 years of silence were quietly finding their way back to a conversation that had never truly ended. Alexander carefully unfolded the paper one more time. The handwriting was slightly faded, but every word remained clear. He looked down before speaking. I must have read this 100 times. Naomi smiled gently. Then you know I never hated you. He nodded slowly. That is what made it so much harder. He looked into her eyes, no longer trying to hide the regret he had carried for years. I kept telling myself that once the company was stable, once the deals were finished, once everything was perfect, I would come find you. Naomi listened quietly. But there was always one more meeting, she said softly. Alexander lowered his head. Yes. The honesty of that single word seemed heavier than any apology he could have offered. A young volunteer walked past them carrying a stack of books and smiled politely before disappearing into the crowd. Naomi watched the girl for a moment. Do you remember our first library event? She asked. Alexander laughed quietly through the sadness in his voice. Only 3 children showed up. Naomi nodded. And you spent half the afternoon pretending to be a pirate because one little boy refused to read unless there was an adventure. For the first time that evening, Alexander genuinely smiled. I still have the paper hat he made for me. Naomi looked surprised. You kept that. He looked back at her. I kept more than you think. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket again and removed a small photograph. The edges had become worn over the years. It showed the 2 of them standing outside the tiny library in Brooklyn, laughing while 3 children held up their first library cards. Naomi touched the picture gently. I thought you forgot about that day. Alexander slowly shook his head. I forgot how to slow down. I forgot how to listen. I forgot what mattered. But I never forgot you. The words hung quietly between them. Naomi looked toward the ballroom where the final dance had begun. Couples moved beneath the crystal chandeliers while the orchestra played a soft melody. She remembered dreaming that one day she and Alexander would grow old together, sharing simple evenings and quiet mornings no matter how successful he became. Life had chosen a different path, yet standing beside him now, she realized that some parts of love did not disappear. They simply changed shape. Alexander looked at the photograph one last time before folding it carefully. "I spent years building an empire," he said quietly. "People tell me I have everything a man could want." He looked into her warm brown eyes, and his voice almost broke. "But every time I came home, the house felt empty because the one person who believed in me before the world did was no longer there." Naomi felt tears gather gently in her eyes. Not because she wanted to go back, but because she finally saw the truth in the man standing before her. The young dreamer from the little apartment in Brooklyn had never completely disappeared. He had simply been buried beneath ambition and expectations. She reached out and gently closed his fingers around the old letter. "Alexander," she whispered, "sometimes people lose their way because they are trying too hard to build a future. The important thing is whether they ever find the courage to look back and see what they left behind." As the orchestra played the final notes of the evening, Alexander realized that no business victory had ever required more courage than the words he was about to say. Alexander took a slow breath as the final notes of the orchestra faded into the quiet hum of the ballroom. He looked at Naomi, at the woman who had once believed in a young man with empty pockets and impossible dreams, and he understood that there would never be a perfect moment to undo 5 years of silence. There was only this one. "I am sorry," he said softly. The words were simple, but they carried every lonely night, every unopened memory, and every regret he had hidden behind success. "I spent so much time trying to become the man the world expected me to be that I forgot the person I wanted to become for you." Naomi looked at him with calm eyes. She did not rush to answer. She had learned that some moments deserved silence before words. Around them, the celebration was slowly coming to an end. Guests were gathering their coats, saying their goodbyes, and stepping out into the cool New York night. The great ballroom that had seemed so full only hours before was becoming quiet. Alexander reached into his pocket one last time and took out the small silver ring. The light from the chandeliers reflected softly across its worn surface. "I carried this with me tonight because I thought maybe I would finally have the courage to tell you what I should have said years ago." Naomi looked at the ring but made no move toward it. Alexander lowered his eyes. "I do not expect you to come back. I do not deserve that. I only wanted you to know that losing you was the greatest mistake of my life." A gentle breeze drifted through the open balcony doors, carrying with it the distant sounds of the city they had once dreamed about together. Naomi smiled sadly. "Do you remember what you told me when you gave me that ring?" Alexander nodded. "I said I would give you the life you deserved." She looked toward the skyline. "You already had." Tears quietly gathered in his eyes. For the first time in many years, he allowed himself to feel them. Naomi slowly reached out and closed his fingers around the ring. "Some people come into our lives to stay forever," she whispered. "Others come to teach us who we are meant to be." Alexander looked at her, unable to speak. "You taught me that love should never have to compete with ambition," she continued. "And I hope I taught you that success means very little if you have nobody to share it with." She gently stepped back. There was no anger in her heart, no bitterness, only peace. Across the ballroom, one of the young girls from the foundation ran toward Naomi, holding a stack of books. "Miss Naomi, everyone is waiting for you." Naomi smiled warmly and looked back at Alexander one final time. "Take care of yourself," she said softly. Then she turned and walked toward the children. They surrounded her immediately, laughing and talking as they left the ballroom together. Alexander remained where he was, the little silver ring resting quietly in his hand. Richard walked over and stood beside him without saying a word. Together they watched the doors slowly close behind Naomi. The city lights reflected against the windows, just as they had years ago beside the East River when two young dreamers believed the future belonged to them. Alexander looked down at the ring and finally understood that some fortunes could never be measured by money. The greatest gift he had ever been given was the woman who believed in him before the world did, and although he could not change the past, he could carry that lesson for the rest of his life. Outside, beneath the first light of a new morning, Naomi walked forward without looking back, and for the first time in many years, both of them had finally found their way home.